The poetry essay, often dreaded. How do you do well at a poetry essay? Well, today I'm going to be showing you how to approach this task in your test or an exam. And I'm going to be using the poem We Wear the Mask, which is a prescribed grade 11 poem. Also be referencing The Caged Bird, which is a currently prescribed grade 10 poem, just to use as an example. But the same steps apply to really any poem. I can't take credit for these slides. Thank you to Mr. MG for these slides. Right, the poetry essay is a form of literary essay. And what I mean by that is you don't approach it like a creative writing essay. You have been given a topic or a question, and the purpose of your response is to prove whether you agree, disagree, to what extent. You've got to make a point. And you've got to write in the present tense, and you've got to be objective. You've got to make a point. You've got to explain that point. Why did you say that point? Give me some quote or some direct reference to back up or support your statement. Important aspects to consider is the question itself, the structure of the question, and the tone. What is required of you? How are you expected to approach this question? It's very rare that you would be given a question and say, to what extent is XYZ, and it's to no extent. Okay, like let's say the poet has now written this poem, and we are saying that the poem is all about the mystery of love, right? And he's written that in his poem, and now we're saying, to what extent is the poem about the mystery of love? It's very rare that you're going to say it's got nothing to do with the mystery of love, when here is this popular, well-known poet who's written this poem, one of many, about the mystery of love, and you suddenly going to come along and say, no, he's wrong. So unless you can back it up and support your argument very, very well. So just keep that in mind. So when we look at the question, we got to say to ourselves, okay, there are key words in this question that are going to guide me in terms of what is expected of me. How do I approach this? And a lot of guys will try and ignore the poetry the poetry essay question, not even give it a second look. But I really want to encourage you to not just pass over the poetry essay question, because it's actually very easy to do well in a poetry essay. It's very easy to get 7 out of 10, for example. So let's have a look. When I've got the topic, I need to find out what are those key words. For example, if we were doing We Wear the Mask, you might get a topic like this. You may have noticed that the poem doesn't sound light and cheerful. In an essay of approximately 200 to 280 words, critically discuss the contradiction between tone and theme, brought out of imagery and form, and how it contributes to the effectiveness of the poem. Now, maybe at first glance, that is a bit overwhelming. What am I supposed to do? What does that even mean? So by saying that the question is relatively loaded means there's a lot of things in that topic which you need to look at. So, first of all, you've been given a statement that it's not light and cheerful, right? Then it says, discuss the contradiction, so there's a word, a contradiction, between tone and theme. Now the theme is created or shown through the use of imagery and form being the structure of the poem. So how does this contradiction contribute to the effectiveness of the poem? Why is the poem effective? So somewhere in your answer, you're going to have to say that the poem is effective because of the contradiction between the tone and the theme. That is really what you're taking out of that topic. If you find the topic as it's written here confusing and it takes a while to figure out what is required, feel free to write it in your own words, so that every time you go back to it, you don't have to try and figure out what is being asked of you. However, note that every statement, everything that you write in your response must be contributing to answering the question. If the point is not relevant, in terms of doing anything about proving this, throw it out. Okay. It's also incredibly important that you use the peel technique. And what does the peel technique mean? Well, the peel technique means that you're going to make a point. It's a little acronym to remember. Each paragraph must have a point, right? Once you've made your point, explain the point, elaborate on it. That's the second E. The third E will provide evidence. So in other words, you made that point, you came to that point because of something that you read in the poem. What was it? So you're going to have to quote a line or two lines or a word maybe. There's something there that helped you come to that point. And it's very important that you do quote something out of the poem to prove your point. Otherwise, did you just thumbsuck it out of thin air? Did you read it on the internet or what? Then finally, the L part in the peel acronym is your link. You know, why did you make that point? Well, I made that point because of its link to the topic, you know, whatever the topic was. In other words, this point is valid because it links to the topic. It helps prove the topic. Okay, so here we go. Introduction. What is it that I'm looking for? So I go back here and I see I'm looking for tone that I have to discuss. I have to discuss theme. How am I going to do that? Because I'm going to discuss imagery and I'm going to discuss form, which is structure. And all of that is going to prove whether or not that is effective. Okay. Finally, the conclusion would be restate really the topic in a sense to answer that so what question. You know, I've said all of this, so what? Because it proves the topic. All right. Notes on the style of writing, always present tense, because a literary essay by definition means that it can be read, the literary work, whether it's a novel or a play or a poem, can be read at any time, present tense. You must use third person, because remember, you've got to be objective. Be formal, so that means no contractions. Incorporate the quotes. Don't just like put a quote by itself in the middle of nowhere. Use that quote in your sentence, give it flow so that you can make a point and then the quote backs up your point within the same sentence. Okay, so that's my introduction. How am I going to write my introduction? I'm not going to just like put the topic there, all right? Let's say the disempowered often need to conceal emotions such as pain, anger, frustration to ensure their safety. Through the uses of imagery and form, the poet uses a contrast between the expected tone and the theme to reinforce this message. That is an example of an introduction for this topic. Okay, so everything that is in the topic I've put in my introduction in my own words, and it's very clear to the reader of what he or she is going to read after the introduction. So if I look at this one, I know a little bit about the theme already because there's anger, frustration, pain, and all that. I know I'm going to read something about imagery and form. I know I'm going to read something about a contrast between the tone and the theme. All right, so that's a great example of an introduction. Okay. The body, going to keep one main idea per paragraph. So let's say, for example, in the first paragraph, I'm going to talk about theme, right? And what's very nice is that in your topic, it actually will give you what each paragraph must contain. So, for example, here it's saying there's got to be a paragraph on tone, there's got to be a paragraph on theme. But that means that it's imagery and form. So actually, I'm going to have one paragraph on tone, one paragraph on imagery, one paragraph on form. That's essentially what they're going to ask you. Let's say, for example, that you can talk a lot about imagery, and you need 2 paragraphs. Go for it. Don't be so concerned that you don't have as much to talk about on tone as you do on structure, let's say. As long as you are addressing all those key words, that's fine. Okay. So, for example, like let's say we're using the PEEL acronym now. I would make a point. The poem is a rondo, which is a very regular and structured form of poetry. That's my point. And you know the characteristics of a rondo. Alright? Now, why have I made that point? Because it talks about the form of the poem, the structure. So, explanation would be there is a clear rhyme scheme using rhyming couplets to add to the pace of the poem. Alright? Then I would give an evidence of that. So I would quote something. And then finally I would link that back to the topic. Here's another point. The meter is mostly an iambic tetrameter, and it includes a repetition of "We Wear the Mask" as a refrain, almost like a hymn. So that's another point that I could make. And then I would have to elaborate on that, quote something, or at least paraphrase something as evidence, and then link it back to the topic. And those are other points that I can make. The use of the metaphor. Why am I saying a metaphor? Because metaphor links with imagery. When you see the word imagery, think to yourself figures of speech. Like, I've got to talk about figures of speech in the poem that creates the imagery. In other words, that creates the image in the reader's mind that mimics the image in the poet's mind. Then I want to talk about tone. Okay, so I can say the poem also has a musical quality and rhythm that seems disjointed with the lives of tears and sighs of the oppressed, and etc. etc. Tone of defiance. Now, you must say what the tone is. Okay, if it asks you for tone, the expectation is the tone is XYZ. Tone is usually one word. However, if you are confused, or not confused, but you can't quite decide what the tone is, like there could be more than one tone, then don't be afraid to discuss more than one tone. Say, the tone is this because of this and this and this line, you can see this, and this line reveals that, etc. But there's also a tone in this line because of this and this. Sometimes in a poem there are different tones. For example, stanza 1 and 2 may have this tone, stanza 3 and 4 may have that tone. When thinking about a tone, sometimes guys struggle with trying to come up with a word for tone. Try and think first of all, is it a positive or is it a negative tone? Don't use those positive and negative words, but I'm just saying, try and categorize it as that. Then if it's positive, you may think, okay, maybe it's humorous, maybe it's joyful. If it's negative, maybe it's anger, maybe it's bitter, angry, sorry. Maybe it's sarcastic, etc. Finally, the conclusion, so what, as I mentioned. So essentially you're going to revert back to the topic, and without using first person, you're going to third person say that you have in fact proved that the topic, it is effective, or it is true, through the use of imagery, theme, diction, tone, whatever it's asking of you. Alright. So let's use another example, the caged bird. Let's say you got this as a topic. Caged Bird by Maya Angelou highlights experiences of those who are privileged and those who are oppressed. Discuss the validity of the statement in essay up to 260 words with reference to diction, imagery and tone. They love to ask diction, imagery and tone. And in this case, you know that, alright, there's a statement. Those who are privileged and those who are oppressed, the experiences are different. Right? There's a statement. Discuss the validity of the statement. How valid is the statement? As I mentioned, it is a poem that's clearly about that, so the chances of it not being valid is very, very slim. That's risky. It is valid, okay? And it's saying paragraph must be on diction, a paragraph must be on imagery, and a paragraph must be on tone. Diction refers to the words used, like you get a dictionary, so that's easy. Why did the poet use those specific words? And why do those specific words contribute to the different experiences between the privileged and the oppressed? Imagery, again, figures of speech, tone. Simple enough. So here's an introduction. In the poem Caged Bird, the poet used an extended metaphor to highlight the differences between those who are privileged and those who are oppressed. This is further explored through the use of diction, imagery and tone. I've written basically the topic in my own words. It's very clear from this paragraph what I'm going to read. Alright, when you refer to a title, either put it in inverted commas or underline it. So my first paragraph, I'm going to talk about diction. All right. The poet uses contrasting diction to highlight the differences between the caged bird and the free bird. There's the Peel acronym. I've made my point. In stanza 1, verbs such as leaps, floats, dips, and dares are used to describe the free bird. This creates the sense that the free bird is able to take risks. This is contrasted in stanza 2. Diction such as stalks, clipped, and tired is used to describe the caged bird. This creates the sense of restriction, as the caged bird, African American people through the use of the extended metaphor, is oppressed by society. Boom. There I have made my point. I've elaborated on it. I've quoted as evidence that I haven't just thumbsucked that idea. And finally, I've brought it back, linking it back to the topic. Because in the topic, I spoke about an extended metaphor. And there's an extended metaphor. And I'm talking about how they are oppressed by society. And I go back to the topic and it talks about those who are oppressed. The next paragraph will talk about imagery. Uses detailed imagery to highlight the different experiences of the caged bird and free birds. There's my point. And I'm going to elaborate and use evidence to support my argument. Lastly, the link, the L in the Peel acronym. This image suggests that the caged bird, oppressed person, has no hope left as his or her dreams are unable to be realized. Therefore, a contrast is created. Go back here. Talks about how there are differences between the privileged and the oppressed. You see how that's linking back to the topic. Then I talk about tone. Tone is defiant, clear through the repeated image of the caged bird opening its throat to sing, blah blah blah. And finally, my conclusion would be, therefore it is evident that the poet addresses the differences between those who are privileged and those who are oppressed through the use of diction, imagery, and tone. This is not like the be-all and the end-all of all possible responses to this topic. It is just an example, but this would get a good mark because I have followed the Peel acronym. I've got a good introduction, a decent conclusion, and I've spoken about everything that I need to speak about. I've spoken about that contrast, and I've spoken about diction, imagery, and tone that are used to create it. So guys, I hope that helps with how to approach a poetry essay.